The consensus narrative has collapsed. For nearly 3 years, Western analysts and television commentators assured you that Ukraine lacked the capability, the reach, and the authorization to bring this war home to Moscow. That assessment is now operationally obsolete. In the early morning, Ukraine executed what I call the Belgorod Breach, a synchronized multi-domain assault that represents the single most significant penetration of Russian homeland defense infrastructure since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This is not a tactical victory to be celebrated and forgotten. This is a strategic inflection point that fundamentally redefines the parameters of this conflict and exposes vulnerabilities in Russian defensive doctrine that Moscow spent 3 decades and billions of dollars convincing itself did not exist. We are witnessing the operationalization of deep strike warfare against a nuclear-armed adversary that believed its strategic depth was inviolable. Belgorod is not just a border city. It is a critical logistics node, a rail artery feeding Russian forces across the southern front, and a psychological symbol of mainland invulnerability. When Ukrainian long-range drones, HIMARS missiles, and Storm Shadow cruise missiles penetrated layered air defense networks that were supposed to render such strikes impossible, they shattered the fundamental assumption underlying Russian strategic planning that the war could be prosecuted externally while the homeland remained a sanctuary. That assumption is dead, and with it dies the operational framework that has governed Russian military planning since February 20. This analysis will not replicate the shallow commentary you encounter from cable news or policy institutes. This is an assessment grounded in strategic realism. The Macgregor doctrine, context-driven, empirically rigorous, focused exclusively on verifiable facts of military capability, geographic reality, and the cold calculus of state power. We will dissect the tactical execution in granular detail and examine what this breach reveals about systemic failures in Russian defensive posture, the cascading implications for force disposition, logistics security, and escalation management that now define this conflict. You are about to receive a comprehensive breakdown of what happened, why Russian defenses failed catastrophically, and most critically, why this matters far beyond the immediate tactical outcome. Understanding Belgorod is understanding the fundamental shift in how this war will be prosecuted going forward and what that shift means for escalation pathways, strategic stability, and the risk that this regional conflict metastasizes into something far more dangerous. Prepare for an unsparing analysis. In the early morning, something unprecedented happened. Ukraine didn't just strike Russian territory. They dismantled the operational architecture Moscow thought was impregnable. Long-range drones lifted off from concealed airfields deep inside Ukrainian territory, flying under 150 feet to evade radar detection. Simultaneously, HIMARS missiles worth $100,000 each launched from positions near Dnipro, while a low-flying Su-24M deployed a Storm Shadow cruise missile valued at $1.5 million. This wasn't a retaliatory strike. This was surgical, multi-layered warfare designed to crack open Russia's defensive belt in seconds. The target, Belgorod, a critical node in Russia's Western defense network. Within 9 seconds of the first launch, the silence shattered. What followed wasn't just an attack, it was a statement about the evolved nature of modern warfare. Ukraine demonstrated they could coordinate air, ground, and electronic assets to penetrate defenses that cost Russia billions to construct. The strike wasn't about territory, it was about exposing vulnerabilities in a system Moscow believed was untouchable. Why does this matter? Because Belgorod isn't just another border town. It's a logistics hub, a rail artery feeding Russian forces on the southern front, and a psychological symbol of mainland security. When Ukraine breached it, they didn't just destroy infrastructure, they shattered the illusion of Russian strategic depth. Russian generals had spent years boasting about layered air defense networks, hardened command centers, and the vast buffer zone that protected the motherland. In less than 10 minutes, that narrative collapsed. Consider the tactical execution. Ukrainian planners didn't launch a single wave. They orchestrated a symphony of destruction. Drones drew out air defenses, revealing radar positions. HIMARS strikes eliminated those positions. Storm Shadow missiles then penetrated the gaps, hitting hardened targets deep inside the defensive perimeter. Behind this aerial assault came armored columns, Leopard 2 tanks, and Challenger 2s exploiting the chaos, punching through fence lines, and establishing forward positions before Russian commanders could coordinate a response. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For Russian citizens, particularly those in border regions, the war was always something happening over there in Ukraine, in the contested territories, but never at home. Now air raid sirens wail in Russian cities. Civilians film explosions from their balconies. The distance between the front line and the home front has collapsed, and with it the comfort of denial. And this was only the opening move. The question now isn't whether Ukraine can strike inside Russia. The question is, What does Russia do when its homeland defense becomes a front line? How does Moscow respond when the strategic depth it has relied upon for centuries is suddenly contested? When your rear areas are as vulnerable as your forward positions, traditional military doctrine breaks down. You can't concentrate forces for offensive operations if you must simultaneously defend your logistics hubs, fuel depots, and command centers hundreds of kilometers behind the lines. This is the strategic dilemma Ukraine has engineered, and it's one Russia has no easy answer for. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Belgorod, you need to step back to February 2022. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion, the strategic calculus was clear. Deep strikes into Russian territory were off the table. Ukraine lacked the range, the platforms, and frankly, the Western approval to bring the war home to Moscow. For nearly 2 years, the conflict remained asymmetric. Russia could strike Kiev, Lviv, and Odessa with impunity, while Ukraine was constrained to defensive operations within its own borders. This asymmetry wasn't just military, it was psychological. Russian leadership could present the war as a limited operation, something manageable, something that wouldn't touch ordinary Russian lives. But war is a learning environment. By late 2023, Ukraine had begun developing indigenous long-range drone capabilities, some with ranges exceeding 600 kilometers. These weren't sophisticated cruise missiles, they were adapted commercial drones, fitted with explosives, guided by GPS and launched in swarms. Low-cost, high-impact. Concurrently, Western reluctance to provide deep strike munitions began eroding. Storm Shadow missiles from the UK and Scalp missiles from France quietly entered Ukrainian arsenals. The United States, while still cautious about ATAC-MS usage inside Russia, stopped enforcing hard red lines. The strategic environment had shifted, and Moscow failed to adjust. Russia, meanwhile, grew complacent. Its air defense network, comprising S-400 systems, Pantsir launchers, and layered radar arrays, was designed for a different threat model. It anticipated NATO-style high-altitude bombing campaigns, cruise missiles launched from standoff ranges, ballistic missiles following predictable trajectories. What it didn't anticipate was swarms of cheap terrain-hugging drones mixed with precision cruise missiles, all operating in coordinated waves with electronic warfare support. This created exploitable gaps. Ukraine studied them, mapped them, and waited for the right moment. Historically, Russia has always relied on strategic depth, the vast expanse of territory that absorbs and exhausts invaders. Napoleon learned this in 1812. Hitler learned it in 1941. But in the drone age, depth becomes a liability when your logistics nodes, command centers, and fuel depots are scattered across thousands of kilometers of poorly defended rear areas. Ukraine recognized this fundamental shift. They didn't need to occupy Russian territory. They just needed to make it untenable for Russia to operate freely in its own backyard. There's also the political dimension. Moscow spent decades building the narrative that Russia was a fortress, protected by nuclear weapons, advanced air defenses, and sheer geographic scale. This narrative served domestic political purposes. It justified military spending, reinforced national pride, and insulated leadership from accountability. But narratives are only as strong as their connection to reality. When Ukrainian drones start hitting targets 600 kilometers inside Russia, when fuel depots explode in broad daylight, when air defense systems fail to intercept threats they were designed to stop, the narrative cracks. And once it cracks, political stability becomes harder to maintain. That moment came at Belgorod, and it revealed something Moscow didn't want to acknowledge. Their fortress had cracks, and Ukraine knew exactly where to hit them. The question now is whether Russia can adapt its defensive posture faster than Ukraine can exploit these vulnerabilities. The assault on Belgorod wasn't a single strike. It was a synchronized offensive spanning multiple domains. Ukrainian long-range drones, each costing less than $50,000, flew terrain-hugging routes under radar coverage. These weren't suicide missions. They were intelligent probes designed to map defensive responses. They weren't just delivering explosives, they were drawing out Russian air defenses, forcing S-400 batteries and Pantsir systems to reveal their positions. The moment those radars activated, HIMARS missiles locked onto their signatures and eliminated them. This is called suppression of enemy air defenses, or SAID, and Ukraine executed it with precision that would impress NATO planners. Behind the drone swarm came the armor. Leopard 2A6 tanks, each valued at approximately $10 million, surged through breach perimeters alongside British Challenger 2s worth $8.5 million each. These weren't symbolic deployments. They were exploitation forces designed to capitalize on the chaos created by the airstrikes. Moving at over 40 miles per hour, they stormed through broken fence lines. There were 120mm cannons blasting through bunkers and fuel trucks. A direct hit from a Leopard shell collapsed an enemy command post, the explosion visible from miles away. Ukrainian motorized infantry followed, laying $500 anti-tank mines at strategic choke points. When Russian T-72 tanks attempted a counterattack from the west, they drove directly into kill zones. The lead tank struck a mine, the column stalled. Javelin missiles and NL Labos finished what the mine started. By morning, Belgorod's rail yard was burning. Fuel depots erupted into towering columns of black smoke visible for miles. But Ukraine didn't stop there. They understood that momentum in warfare is everything. Hours later, the assault extended to Voronezh, an industrial hub critical to Russia's southern supply corridor, located 200 kilometers deeper into Russian territory. Su-27 and MiG-29 fighters equipped with JDAM kits on freefall bombs punched through gaps in radar coverage and released precision payloads onto fuel storage facilities. The explosions were catastrophic, orange mushroom clouds billowing upward as shockwaves shattered windows across entire districts. Russia responded, but the response was reactive, not strategic. From the depths of the Black Sea, a Kilo-class submarine launched Caliber cruise missiles toward advancing Ukrainian columns. Each missile cost over $1 million, but before they could reach their targets, U.S.-supplied Patriot PAC-3 systems stationed near Pavlohrad sprang to life. At $4 million per interceptor, it wasn't cheap, but it worked. The sky lit up as kinetic warheads smashed 2 missiles mid-air. A third got through, hitting a bridge, but not enough to stop the offensive. On the ground, the real chaos unfolded. Dozens of Ukrainian FPV kamikaze drones, costing less than $3,000 each, zipped down highways like guided wasps, targeting Russian logistics convoys moving fuel, ammunition, and personnel north along the M4 highway. Dashcam footage showed a supply truck turning a corner, then vanishing in a ball of fire. One Russian BTR armored carrier swerved, only to be hit from above. It burned for hours. Russian reinforcements attempted to push in from the east, but the main fuel hub had already been destroyed. Within 6 hours, Voronezh was cut off and Moscow's southern supply artery was hemorrhaging. The question now was, could Russia stabilize, or would the bleeding continue? Let's assess this clinically. What we're witnessing isn't a tactical setback for Russia. It's a systemic failure of strategic planning and institutional adaptation. Moscow's entire defensive posture was predicated on 2 fundamental assumptions. First, that Ukraine lacked the capability for sustained deep strikes. Second, that Western support wouldn't extend to offensive operations inside Russian territory. Both assumptions have now collapsed, and the implications cascade through every level of Russian military planning. From a military perspective, Russia's air defense network is designed for Cold War-era threats. High-altitude bombers, cruise missiles launched from standoff ranges, ballistic missiles following predictable trajectories. The S-400 system, Russia's premier air defense platform, excels against these conventional threats. It's optimized for engagement envelopes measured in hundreds of kilometers, tracking fast-moving targets at high altitudes. But it's not optimized for low-cost, low-altitude drone swarms, operating in coordinated waves with electronic warfare support and terrain masking tactics. Ukraine exploited this asymmetry brilliantly. By mixing $50,000 drones with $105 million Storm Shadow missiles, they created a targeting dilemma that overwhelms traditional air defense doctrine. Russian air defense commanders face an impossible choice. Do you shoot down the cheap drone that might be a decoy, expending a $500,000 interceptor missile? Or do you conserve resources for the high-value cruise missile that might already be past your engagement envelope? When you're facing dozens of simultaneous targets approaching from multiple vectors at varying altitudes, the decision cycle collapses. Paralysis sets in. This speaks to a broader problem in Russian military doctrine: over-reliance on prestige platforms at the expense of distributed, adaptive systems. The S-400 is an excellent system against the threats it was designed to counter 40 years ago, but warfare has evolved. Modern conflict involves drone swarms, electronic spoofing, cyber warfare, coordinated saturation attacks, threats that exploit the seams between traditional air defense layers. Ukraine understood this and weaponized it. They didn't try to defeat the S-400 head-on, they rendered it irrelevant by changing the nature of the threat environment. Now consider the strategic implications. Russia can no longer assume its rear areas are safe. Every logistics hub, every fuel depot, every command center within 600 kilometers of the Ukrainian border is now a potential target. This forces Moscow into an impossible position. Do they withdraw air defense assets from the front lines to protect the homeland, weakening their offensive capability? Or do they accept that their strategic depth is now contested and plan accordingly? Either choice represents a strategic defeat. There's also the operational dimension. Modern militaries depend on logistics, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, medical supplies. These flow through predictable corridors, rail lines, highways, supply depots. When those corridors become contested, when supply convoys must travel under constant threat of drone strikes, operational tempo collapses, offensive operations stall, units at the front run short on ammunition, morale deteriorates. This is exactly what Ukraine is engineering. And then there's the psychological dimension. For Russian leadership, the strikes on Belgorod and Voronezh aren't just military setbacks. They're political embarrassments that undermine core narratives. The Kremlin spent years assuring the Russian public that the special military operation would remain distant, contained, manageable. Now Russian civilians are filming explosions over their own cities. The war Moscow promised would stay over there has come home, and that changes the political calculus in ways that are difficult to predict but impossible to ignore. The question is no longer whether Ukraine can reach Moscow, it's whether Moscow can stop them and at what cost. When you push an adversary into a corner, you force them to make choices they'd prefer to avoid. Russia now faces several escalation pathways, none of them palatable, all of them dangerous. The first is conventional escalation, redeploying forces from other theaters, calling up additional reserves, intensifying strikes on Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. We've already seen glimpses of this: increased caliber missile launches from Black Sea submarines, more aggressive air operations near the border, expanded mobilization efforts in Russian regions far from Moscow. But conventional escalation has hard limits. Russia's military is already stretched thin across a 1,000-kilometer front. Pulling forces from one sector to reinforce another creates vulnerabilities elsewhere, and the manpower problem is real. Russia has already mobilized hundreds of thousands of reservists, many poorly trained and equipped. The second pathway is unconventional escalation. This could include cyber warfare targeting Western support networks, sabotage operations against critical infrastructure in Europe, or proxy actions through third parties in different theaters. Russia has demonstrated both capability and willingness to operate in gray zones, disinformation campaigns that sow political discord, energy blackmail that exploits European dependence on Russian gas, covert strikes on undersea cables and pipeline infrastructure. The risk here is miscalculation. A cyber attack on a NATO member's power grid or financial system could trigger Article 5 considerations, expanding the conflict in ways neither side wants but both might struggle to contain once the spiral begins. Then there's the escalation everyone fears but few discuss openly: tactical nuclear use. Let me be extraordinarily clear. This remains unlikely, but it's no longer unthinkable, and that shift in probability is itself significant. Russian military doctrine, as revised in 2020, includes explicit provisions for limited nuclear strikes in response to threats to the state's existence. If Ukraine continues deep strikes, if Moscow perceives its ability to govern or defend the homeland is fundamentally compromised, if conventional options appear exhausted, the threshold for nuclear consideration lowers. This doesn't mean Russia will use nuclear weapons. It means the strategic calculus that once made such use unthinkable has shifted into the realm of conceivable options. What would tactical nuclear use actually look like? Most analysts believe the first use would be a demonstration strike, a low-yield detonation in an unpopulated area designed to shock Ukraine and the West into negotiations. The target wouldn't be Kyiv or Lviv. It might be a military staging area in western Ukraine, a logistics hub, or even a symbolic detonation over the Black Sea. The message would be unmistakable: we are willing to cross the ultimate threshold. Are you? But demonstration strikes carry enormous risks. They often fail to demonstrate anything except weakness and desperation. They invite international condemnation, economic isolation that dwarfs current sanctions, potential NATO military response, and retaliation from Ukraine itself, which may have its own asymmetric options. Beyond nuclear considerations, there's the risk of uncontrolled escalation, what strategists call escalation dominance failure. The scenario goes like this: Ukraine strikes deep into Russia. Russia retaliates against Western supply lines in Poland or Romania. NATO responds with direct military aid or limited strikes against Russian logistics nodes. Russia perceives this as NATO entry into the conflict and broadens targeting. Suddenly you're in a conflict spiral where neither side can afford to back down without appearing defeated, where each escalatory step seems justified as a response to the previous one. This is how regional wars become great power conflicts. This is how World War I started, not through grand strategic planning, but through cascading commitments and miscalculations. The most dangerous scenario isn't the one where leaders make deliberate, calculated decisions based on clear information. It's the one where fog of war, miscommunication, domestic political pressure, and sheer chaos force decisions no one intended. And that scenario becomes more likely with every strike that brings the war closer to Moscow, with every casualty that demands vengeance, with every day this conflict continues without a clear pathway to resolution. While strategists debate doctrine and policymakers calculate risks, real people bear the consequences. In Moscow, civilians now sleep uneasily, wondering if the next air raid siren will bring drones over their neighborhoods. Parents wake their children in the middle of the night, rushing to shelters that weren't needed a month ago. In Belgorod and Voronezh, families evacuate as infrastructure crumbles around them, packing what belongings they can carry, leaving homes they expected to be safe. This is the human face of strategic escalation, the grandmother filming explosions from her balcony, the father trying to explain to his children why the windows are shaking, the young couple debating whether to flee to relatives in Siberia. But the impact extends far beyond Russia's borders. In Europe, energy markets tighten as supply disruptions multiply. Germany faces difficult choices about industrial production as natural gas supplies become uncertain. Poland and the Baltic states watch nervously, knowing that if Russia perceives NATO involvement in Ukrainian deep strikes, they become potential targets for retaliation. Defense ministers in Warsaw, Vilnius, and Tallinn are running contingency scenarios, updating civil defense plans, and quietly moving military assets into defensive positions. Germany debates whether to increase military spending yet again, each budget reallocation a political battle. France considers whether its Storm Shadow exports make it a co-belligerent under international law. Every Western capital calculates the same question: how much support can we provide before we're drawn into direct conflict? For Ukraine, the strategic gains come with profound costs. Yes, they've demonstrated capability and resolve that surprised many observers. Yes, they've forced Russia onto the defensive in its own territory, achieving what seemed impossible 2 years ago. But every deep strike requires scarce resources, missiles that cost millions, drones that must be manufactured with limited industrial capacity, intelligence assets that must be coordinated through Western support networks. And for every successful strike, there's the risk of Russian retaliation against Ukrainian cities that have already endured relentless bombardment. Kharkiv, Odessa, Dnipro, these cities have absorbed thousands of missile and drone strikes. Escalation invites more. Power grids that barely function now face total collapse. Water treatment facilities operate intermittently. Hospitals struggle to maintain basic services. There's also the broader question of war termination that haunts every honest assessment of this conflict. How does this war end when both sides are now striking deep into each other's territory? Negotiations become harder when national pride and fundamental security perceptions are engaged. Russia can't negotiate from a position where its homeland is under sustained attack without appearing weak domestically, potentially threatening regime stability. Ukraine can't accept a settlement that leaves Russian forces on its soil without betraying the sacrifices of hundreds of thousands. The gap between maximalist positions and realistic outcomes widens with every escalatory step, with every city destroyed, with every casualty that demands the war be worth the price. Globally, this conflict is fundamentally reshaping alliances and strategic thinking in ways we're only beginning to understand. China watches carefully, learning lessons about Western resolve, military capabilities, economic warfare, and the true costs of territorial aggression. India balances its relationships with Moscow and Washington, seeing opportunities but also risks in a multipolar world. Middle Eastern states recalibrate their energy partnerships, recognizing that European desperation creates leverage. The international order that emerged after 1991, American primacy, European integration, rules-based institutions, is fracturing under the pressure of renewed great power competition. The war in Ukraine isn't just about Ukraine anymore. It's become a proving ground for 21st century conflict, and the lessons learned here will echo in future confrontations across the globe. So where does this leave us? Ukraine has demonstrated conclusively that Russia's strategic depth is not the sanctuary Moscow believed it to be. Belgorod, Voronezh, and potentially Moscow itself are now within reach of Ukrainian strike capabilities developed through a combination of indigenous innovation and Western support. This fundamentally alters the strategic calculus in ways that will shape this conflict for months or years to come. Russia can no longer conduct offensive operations with the comfortable assumption that its rear areas are secure. Every logistics convoy, every command post, every fuel depot, every rail junction must now factor in the real risk of Ukrainian strikes that can come at any time, from any direction. But capability alone doesn't determine outcomes in war. The critical question is whether Ukraine can sustain this operational tempo against an adversary with vastly greater resources, and whether Russia can adapt its defensive posture fast enough to blunt future strikes. History suggests that initial tactical successes often give way to defensive adaptations. Russia will learn from Belgorod. They'll disperse critical assets, harden key facilities, invest in counter-drone systems, adjust their air defense networks to address the swarm threat, and implement passive defensive measures that make targeting more difficult. The Ukrainian advantage today may erode tomorrow. This is the nature of military adaptation, action, reaction, counter-reaction. The broader strategic picture remains stubbornly grim. Neither side appears capable of delivering a decisive blow that would force capitulation or fundamentally alter the territorial status quo. Ukraine lacks the manpower and resources for a sustained offensive deep into Russian territory that could threaten Moscow or force a collapse. Russia lacks the competence, equipment, and increasingly the public support for a renewed push toward Kyiv or any other major Ukrainian city. What we're witnessing is a grinding war of attrition punctuated by moments of tactical brilliance like the Belgorod strikes, but with no clear pathway to strategic resolution that both sides could accept. For Western policymakers, the lesson should be clear but remains politically difficult to implement. Half measures prolong conflict without resolving it. If the goal is Ukrainian victory defined as restoration of 1991 borders, then support must be sufficient to achieve that goal decisively. More advanced weapons, sustained economic aid, robust intelligence sharing, and perhaps most importantly, long-term commitment that outlasts election cycles. If the goal is negotiated settlement that preserves Ukrainian sovereignty while acknowledging territorial realities, then diplomatic frameworks must be pursued aggressively with creative solutions to intractable problems. What we cannot continue doing is providing just enough aid to keep Ukraine fighting, but not enough to win. That's a recipe for endless war, mounting casualties, escalation risks that grow with each passing month, and ultimate strategic exhaustion. As you watch these events unfold, ask yourself fundamental questions. What are we trying to achieve, and what are we willing to risk to achieve it? What does victory look like, and is it attainable? What does acceptable compromise look like, and is it achievable? Because wars don't end on their own. They end when one side prevails decisively, or when both sides conclude that continued fighting serves no strategic purpose and costs exceed any conceivable benefit. We're not at either point yet, and until we are, the strikes will continue, the casualties will mount, and the risk of catastrophic escalation will loom over every decision made in Kyiv, Moscow, and Washington. This is the reality of modern warfare, precise, brutal, and increasingly difficult to contain once unleashed. Ukraine has proven it can strike the heart of Russian power. The question now is whether that capability translates into sustainable strategic advantage, or whether it simply opens the door to a darker, more dangerous phase of this conflict. History will judge not just what happened at Belgorod, but what we chose to do in response. The choices made in the coming weeks and months will determine whether this war moves toward resolution or spirals towards something far worse. Choose wisely. If this analysis gave you a clearer understanding of the strategic landscape, share it with others who need context beyond headlines. Comment below with your perspective. Are we witnessing Ukraine's strategic breakthrough or the prologue to uncontrolled escalation? And if you want deeper analysis on the military, geopolitical, and nuclear dimensions of this conflict, let me know what aspects deserve closer examination. The conversation doesn't end here, it's just beginning, and your voice matters in shaping how we understand these pivotal moments in history.